As part of our talk series, we need to keep talking about race. We have been diving deep into the amazing encounter between Jesus and Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. And this meeting between Jesus and Zacchaeus led to Zacchaeus going through this amazing transformation. He went from being a hated tax collector in Jericho, one who was complicit with the Roman Empire in extorting taxes and unjustly treating some of the most vulnerable in society, to turning his life around, turning his priorities around. He actually paid back those he had unjustly treated 4 times the amount, and also gave an incredibly generous donation, half of his wealth, to some of the poorest in the city. And this meeting between Jesus and Zacchaeus has been enabling us to reflect upon the issue of racial inequality and racism in our culture here in the UK. And tragically, we know that racial inequality is a huge issue in our country. And as we have engaged with this topic, God has been convicting many of us of our own silence or passivity in not really taking a stand against some of the structural forms of racism that persist in our country. And to be a follower of Jesus, like Zacchaeus, is to be one who totally changes their priorities, not just to be not racist in a passive sort of way, but to be actively anti-racist. One of the crucial steps that we need to take in order to pursue this path towards racial equality is to become better and better at talking to one another and listening to one another on the topic of racism. One book that I have found incredibly helpful is a book by Ben Lindsay. He is the pastor of a church called Emmanuel Church in London. He is the founder of a charity called Power the Fight, which fights for young people and against youth violence in London. He's an incredible guy. But he writes this book, We Need to Talk About Race. And in the opening section of the book, this is what Ben writes. Talking about race isn't easy. Some of the barriers I have faced in talking to white people about race are defensiveness and dismissiveness. Many of the white people I talk to are not actively racist. They do, however, struggle to acknowledge the privilege that comes with their whiteness, or perhaps have never simply considered them. I want to start a conversation to create opportunities for prayerful reflection, inquiry, understanding and resolution. Ultimately, a conversation that will provoke large and small actions from black and white people to help dismantle racist structures in the church and beyond. The church has been silent for too long on the issue of racism. We need to talk about race. I love that quote. And for this reason, we thought that today, instead of having a normal talk as part of our service, that we would set up a conversation. And so I've invited 3 amazing people to join me for a conversation that we filmed earlier in the week. Flo Sparham heads up our justice team here at St Matthias. She also leads our food bank in Hollingdean, and she is a music teacher. She's a woman of many talents. Frankie Quirk leads one of our groups here at St Matthias. She works for Tier Fund, which is an amazing development organisation with partnerships all over the world. And Larry Anderson works as an IT consultant, most recently for Nike at their headquarters over in Holland. And I would love, as the vicar of St Matthias, for this to be a church where conversations about race and racism become more and more normal in our groups and just in the conversations we have throughout the life of the church. We want to break the taboo in which people, especially white people, struggle to talk about racism. And I want to kind of say right from the outset that Flo and Frankie and Larry and I, none of us can speak on behalf of other people. We can only speak from our own experiences. But we hope that this conversation in some way models the sorts of conversations that we're hoping are happening throughout the church. We fully expect to say things that are not phrased exactly correctly, and none of us claim to be experts in any way. You are completely welcome to disagree with some of the perspectives that are being brought, but the point is that we want to begin the process of normalising talking about race and racism here in St Matthias. So I hope you find this helpful. Larry, Flo, Frankie, thank you so much for joining this conversation. And, in this series, we need to keep talking about race. We have been talking about the tragic reality that racism and racial inequality is sadly very much alive and kicking in our culture. And I'd just love to get your perspective on racism in the UK, particularly on those more covert forms of racism that seems to be such a massive issue in our culture.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Tom. I think from as black boy growing up in South London in the 70s and 80s, there were so many tensions, and I think you seem to see that cycle repeating quite a few times with social unrest. And then there's often a trigger of people being stopped and searched, and to black people that's overt racism, whereas maybe to white people that's covert because maybe it doesn't affect them. In fact, statistically, it affects them much, much less. Yeah. So the growing up and having people calling you names, it was almost something that you just accepted. And then even so, my mother came over here and trained as a midwife. She rose up to teach other midwives, and I was shocked to hear the other day that if you're a black woman in labour, you're much more likely to have a stillborn, or you're much more likely to have a problem in labour that doesn't get resolved with the same quality and the same timeliness as your white counterparts.
I was just going to jump in there, Larry. Something you said that was really interesting. Those statistics about women that I've heard recently too, about women of colour being more likely to be to have stillborn babies, or to have complications in pregnancy that lead to sort of tragedies. And for me, the question and sort of what then, I mean, that's a terrible thing. And that's kind of like, okay, so we know the statistics, we can see that happening. But then there's that deeper question, isn't there? And for me, this is where it's the covert racism, is that, well, why? Why would that be? Why would that happen? So is it that there is actually something physically wrong with black women that, that we make bad babies that die? Well, no, the medical profession and science tells us that absolutely not. That is absolutely not the case. So therefore, it's got to be something about the way we're treating those women, or something about the social constructs around that. And then that's where, for me, it really gets into that thorny question that we don't want to ask, is that why? Why is it then that predominantly white institution, because it's mostly the doctors and nurses are white, although in the NHS it just so happens that we do also have a lot of people of colour there. But why would that happen? And linking it, and then there's those really uncomfortable racist ideas, and it's kind of like going down into those, isn't it? We've pushed them down below the surface. They used to be out there on the tip. We've pushed them down. Ideas about the fact that Black people's bodies are that we're like animals, that we're bestial, that you can put us to work for hours and hours, and that's all right. That if a Black person's complaining about pain, they're probably just putting it on a little bit, because really they should be able to take a bit more. So, and those are really uncomfortable ideas that most people don't consciously think. Yeah. But once upon a time, people did think that. And because we've never talked about it, how can we be sure that the legacy of that idea, and it's covert, it's gone underground, but the legacy of that idea is still there?
And when faced with the statistics around racial inequality, which absolutely confirm all that you're saying around this covert racism, systemic, the flip side for me as a white person is the realization that, oh my goodness, my race, my white skin does in some way favor me in all sorts of subtle ways, in a way that I hadn't realized before. And Frankie, I wonder if you're happy to speak about that kind of realization and what that process has looked like for you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I still remember I was, it's quite late actually, in my master's program. So only 5 years ago that I realized I was white. Because before, obviously, there's racial difference, but it wasn't, so my studies was gender and development and globalization. So looking through the lens of gender really, and just thinking about, and then race is another intersecting difference. But to be honest, I kind of thought of race as something other. I was neutral. People of color they also had to grapple with race. And we were talking about how bodies are racialized, and that's really when I understood that my body is also racialized. I am white, and that it's, we were talking about difference is good. It's the value that we attribute to people based on those differences that is the problem. And when that's at a structural level, that becomes very problematic and difficult. So that I think really helped me. And also thinking about white privilege, there's an essay on kind of unpacking the privilege backpack, I think, and it's kind of a list of things which are I never have to think about this, and you go through it and you're I never think about, if I ask to speak to someone in charge, they're likely to be of my race. If I look at the media, if I look at culture, I'm likely to see widespread representation of my race, of stories that represent me, and that are celebrated and that are positive. And so kind of going through that and realizing all the ways that I'm not just cushioned, but protected, or friends, seeing how friends of colour kind of reacted to police was, I'm I'll go over and find out what's happening over there. They were just hell no, I'm not getting involved in that. And so it's also seeing where it's personal and it impacts people that you care about, and that difference and that gulf that you do experience.
Professor Robert Beckford spoke about the distinction between being just not racist, I'm not racist, to being anti-racist, by which he meant actually the work of anti-racism is proactive, it's not passive. And I'd love to just open up a conversation, ask your perspective on really what it means to proactively be an ally to those who are experiencing racism.
My first reaction to that would be, and this is one that I feel challenged with, but you have to give up power, and it's that thing of being willing to realize that it's to empower someone else, you have to give up some of your own power, and that's quite a hard thing to do. And I see that in terms in lots of different ways in my own life. I don't represent every woman of colour. I've got my own experiences, and in many ways, I am very privileged. In many ways, I have a white family. I grew up with a white family, so my proximity to whiteness has given me huge privilege. I'm privileged in that, I'm educated, middle class. I've got an income. So how do I give up some power? Well, I've got neighbours. Life's very different for them. It's not about me telling them what to do or solving problems for them. It's about me taking a step back and saying, what do you want? And they may name something. They may say, well, what I want is this. And I might disagree with it. I might think, oh, well, I don't think that's the best thing to do. But if I really want to empower them and let them take front stage, I have to stand back and say, okay, well, I will do what I can to make sure that that what you want is what happens. And I think that's very difficult for all of us to allow to serve and to let other people to say, okay, it might not be what I thought was best, but if that's what you want, then, and if that's what you think, yeah, you do it.
Yeah, I was thinking about your question, Tom, about going beyond being like just neutral. And I think like what we're saying is that because of all the power dynamics involved, that like a neutral position is really just reinforcing the status quo, which we already know is unequal. So we have to be proactive to address that. And I think for me, in just trying to understand how I can do that well as a white person thinking about working towards racial inequality, again, like just thinking back in terms of how I understand gender and what I would look for in male allies in breaking down patriarchy, breaking down gender inequality, is, I would want men to speak out in their spaces of influence, to hold other men accountable, to educate their sons, to believe women, to listen to us, to give up spaces on panels and platforms, to prioritize women's voices, to mentor women, to promote women, and to be active, but not to center maleness as the solution, not to be like, okay, you've brought this to our attention, we've got it, we'll take it on from here, or like, you've been doing an okay job, but I think we can fix it now. So just, I'm trying to learn what I can, to listen, and I think the point of believing is good, and also thinking about the statistics. Like, I remember friends of Luke's talking about when they were at Cambridge, they were students at Cambridge, they were from different countries, people of colour, and they were saying how they're always checked at the door to the colleges. And you could say, okay, well, I'm sure they just do security checks, I'm sure they have. And then I took a step back and I was like, well, actually, I haven't been asked, and I'm not a student here, I'm just visiting Luke. And then you hear repetitive patterns. So it's the patterns and the statistics, believing your friends when they have that gut feeling that that's, okay, is this about my race? And as women, we can have that when people interact with us, like, okay, are they interacting with me in that way because I'm a woman? And so believe that in your friends when they speak about their experiences of,
I'd love to just talk about St Matthias Church, because we are on a journey, and I'd love to hear your sense of what you feel the priorities are for us as a church as we seek to eradicate racism and join with, partner with those who are fighting racism in our city and in our culture.
I think what is happening at St Matthias is laudable, really. It's fantastic. I speak to my mum about it. I said, we've got this great sermon series, we need to keep talking about race. It's direct, it's relevant, it's convicting, it's awkward, but it's the right thing to do. And I think it's just about how we then open it up into discussions. I know we've had some discussions in small groups, but it's the how do we then make it practical, and then how do we then become a beacon of hope, really, in our area. How do we re-educate? How do we provide that centre of excellence, really, of anti-racism? I don't have the answers because it's such a big subject, but I think making the start is great.
I'm just made up about the fact that, this, for the first time in my life, I'm, just being here with you three in a forum where we're talking about racism, we're talking about these things, and it's open. It does feel comfortable, even though we're going to make mistakes, we're going to get things wrong. There are difficult subjects, but we're talking about it in such an honest way. It doesn't feel like anyone's trying to sort of deny it or kind of somehow subtly twist it around another way. It's just a really open, honest conversation. Well, it's incredible. I've worked in quite a lot of fields in my life and in different places. And it's here in a Christian church in Brighton that this conversation is happening. And I think, yeah, go for it, St Matthias, that the conversation has started. Because I think that the time is now. Every now and again in history, things happen, don't they? There are pivotal moments where people look back and that was another one of those pivotal moments. And George Floyd's death during COVID, when we were all very paused and perhaps a bit raw because of what was happening, and therefore open to what was going on, not able to rush past it, but really having to stop and see it. I think that has been a pivotal moment that started a new level of conversation that we're now part of.
Flo, Frankie, Larry, thank you so much for your honesty, your wisdom, your faith, and yeah, bless you all for being part of this conversation. Well, I hope you found that conversation stimulating. I hope there were things that you can take away from that. And I would love to invite you to take the opportunity before we come to worship to bring yourself before Jesus, just as Zacchaeus did. Work on the assumption that in meeting Jesus, there is something that he wants to speak to you about, maybe something that he wants to challenge you about. And so, loving Father, that's what we want to do now. We just thank you so much that Jesus called out Zacchaeus by name, and that's what you do to us now. You know us more than we know ourselves, and we want to bring ourselves to you. Would you speak to us as we worship you? Come, Holy Spirit, in Jesus' name.